Okay, thank you. Very nice to see all of you here this evening. Thanks in particular to Fergus for those remarks and for having me and my wife Graciela, who's in the back there here in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much again. I'm going to focus on some myths about suicide that I think will be helpful to identify and then to rebut. That's basically the overall goal for tonight. In the course of doing that, I'll introduce you to a model, a theory of suicidal behavior that I've developed along with my colleagues and students. And we've used this model as a basic way to understand suicidal states, but also as a way to dismantle what we view as pernicious myths about suicide. Pernicious because they leave suicidal people feeling misunderstood, they prevent suicidal people from accessing treatment, and then they leave bereaved family members not feeling understood and with way too many questions that they should already have answered. So that's kind of the agenda for the next, I don't know, Fergus, hour or so, 45 minutes, hour or so. Would that be workable? The bottom of this slide, incidentally, is my email address. If there is a question that you'd like to ask me but that you don't get a chance to ask me here tonight, do feel free to email me. And then if you don't get a chance to jot this down, I'm very accessible. Just Google my name. It's there on the slide. Thomas Joyner is my name. It'll come right up. Graciela and I live in Tallahassee, Florida. That's where Florida State University is, and that's where I've been a professor now for 17 years. So this is what I'm going to talk about is a book that some of you own and that came out a few years ago. It in turn was based on this book which developed that model that I referred to a little bit ago. And I'm going to delve into both of these aspects a little bit tonight. You could easily make the case that death by suicide, suicidal behavior in general, is among the most stigmatized of all human behaviors, bar none. It's hard to think of other behaviors that get this much stigma. And there are some pretty bad ones that deserve to be stigma. And you can make the case that suicide is even stigmatized beyond those things. Now, I've listed a couple. Suicide, you can make the case, is even more stigmatized than appalling things like murder and slavery. Therefore, a very powerful mythology has arisen around it. And one goal of mine has been to debunk those myths. Skip over some of the things in this slide series, so as I do that, forgive me. So why don't we just do away with stigma? That would be a nice start, and I absolutely agree that we should do that. It's just a difficult matter. And one reason that it's difficult, I believe, has to do with this equation, which is a simplification, but as some simplifications are, it's a useful one. And it boils down stigma to two components. One having to do with fear of the thing, and the other having to do with ignorance of the thing. Those two things are different, actually, and I'm going to make the case tonight that we probably should retain some of our fear of mental disorders because they are forces of nature and they deserve our respect, if not our fear. But that doesn't mean we have to be ignorant about them. You can be respectful and even fearful about something and at the same time not be ignorant about it. And that is my goal with regard to suicidal behavior. Thinking about things that deserve our respect and even our fear but not our ignorance, consider these examples. There are things in nature that we should be afraid of. We're inherently wired to react to stimuli like you see here. We should be afraid of things like this. We need not be ignorant about them. This fear circuitry that we have is so sensitive that many of you will have had your fear circuitry lit up merely by seeing those images. Some of you will even have the fear circuitry lit up by these images. As benign as they are, this is a butterfly. Looks pretty harmless. Why would somebody be afraid of it? If you turn it over, it goes like this, and it's got 6 creepy, crawly legs. It's an insect, and there actually are people who develop clinical phobias of butterflies because we're wired to be afraid of things like this. Even clowns. In fact, in some surveys, clowns is the #1 childhood phobia. It's a very common phobia, and one reason is that it kind of disrupts or plays around with a very basic circuitry that we have in our brains having to do with facial recognition. Clowns take advantage of that circuitry and play with it. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's creepy or eerie. That's why there's phobias about clowns. Fears are natural. We should retain our fears of some things in the natural world. Furthermore, people who lack fear are some of the most deranged and dangerous people in our entire society. These two here are both serial killers in the United States. The one on the left more famous than the one on the right. The one on the left is Ted Bundy. The one on the right is an individual from my home state of Florida. Both are deranged and dangerous people because they lack fear to perpetrate things that they should be fearful of perpetrating. This is what you're supposed to feel in response to things like, in this case, being exposed to a visual cliff that you're not expecting. You're supposed to have these automatic fear reactions like this baby's having. One big point of my work is to argue that the loss of fear, and in particular becoming fearless about physical pain, physical injury, and death itself, far from being a good thing, that lays the groundwork for danger. We have a natural fear architecture for a reason. And if you decouple that wiring, things can go awry. Removes a barrier, in other words, to death by suicide. It's not the single cause of it, far from it, but it's part of the pathway that can lead to catastrophe. At least that's the conjecture contained in this book and in some of my subsequent work. Here's the visual summary of the model that I want to introduce you to, and then I want to use this visual sketch as a touchstone to return to time and again to compare it to certain myths that I think are floating around in our cultures. Let me start on the right side of this slide, where it reads, those who are capable of suicide, but actually I should probably reword that to say fearlessness about physical pain, physical injury, and death itself, because that's what I mean here. I'm talking about a learned ability to stare down danger, in particular danger to life and limb. That's what's meant on the right side of the slide, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I haven't referred to the left side of the slide too much, or the left side of the model rather, too much, but let me delve into that now. The question is different on the left side of the model. On the right side, the question has to do with capacity. This is a very fearsome and a very daunting behavior, death by suicide. Question on the right side of the model is who would have the capability to do something that daunting and that fearsome? Question on the left side of the model is different. Who would want to in the first place is the question on the left side. And the answer, twofold. It has to do with two interpersonal states of mind. One we've labeled perceived burdensomeness, and the other we've labeled thwarted belongingness. Just to give you some sense of what we mean by those terms, perceived burdensomeness is the idea in the mind that one's death will be worth more than one's life to others. It's a belief that one holds that one's death will be a benefit to others. Now, a very important point here, notice the word perceived. That's an important aspect of this idea here. And the idea is that the person suffering perceives that their death will be worth more than their life. It's a misperception, actually, but they don't know it to be a misperception. They think it's true. And they're dying on the basis of what really is a misperception that they think is true. It's one of the tragedies, actually, one of the many tragedies of this form of death, is that a misperception is involved. In other words, just to kind of nail this down even more, query the bereaved family members about whether the person's death was worth more than their life to others, and you'll get a very resounding answer about that. The answer is no. Query suicidal people, and they think the answer is yes. And it's that distinction that I'm kind of trying to get at here. And actually the same point applies to authority belongingness. People perceive themselves, wrongly often, but they feel themselves to be hopelessly alienated and disconnected from others. This is a nuance, but it's important to get that people can be literally in the physical presence of loved ones. Loved ones who are saying to them, we love you, we care about you, and nevertheless the person can feel hopelessly alienated and lonely. It's one of the features of our mental equipment that we can feel desperately lonely even in the midst of a crowd and even in the midst of a crowd of loved ones. So these two states characterize, according to this theory, the suicidal mind. They contribute to a desire for suicide, but an assertion of this model is that desire for suicide is not sufficient for death by suicide. People who desire it must also be able to enact the extremely fearsome and daunting act itself, and very few people are capable of that. In fact, I'm going to show some video a little bit later that will show individuals who are desperately suicidal. They desperately desire their death, and yet mercifully their bodies kick in, they flinch, and they're saved at the last moment. The reason that they're saved is that their bodies are not fully on board with the plans of their minds. Their mind can be saying, I want to die, and the body says, that's not my plan, that's not how I was designed. It can be at cross purposes, and it saves people's lives every single day. Tragically, though, as many of you have experienced, as have I, family members, members of our society can overcome that barrier, and that too happens every day. And a big point of my work is to explain how that happens so that people get into these vulnerability states. As a matter of fact, let's see one example of an individual. This person is being interviewed, and he's being questioned about his own history, not actually of frank suicidal behavior, but rather, so he's being interviewed not about his history of frank suicidal behavior, but rather of a distinct phenomenon. In the States, we call it non-suicidal self-injury. Basically, he injures himself not with the intent to die, but rather with an intent to do something different. Actually, he'll be asked what his intent is for the behaviors that he does. Now, as he speaks, keep in mind that visual sketch of the theory that I showed for a moment ago, and try to place this individual within that visual sketch. Where does he fit mostly, would you say? So this is just a couple minutes. I'll just play it and then make some comments about his remarks.
I have, and I've cut myself a lot, and I've ingested things like bed hooks. One time a cassette Walkman down at Lucasville, breaking it up and swallowing it piece by piece. And, like I said, bed hooks, razor blades, ink pens, pencils, toothbrushes. October of last year at Lucasville, I ingested 4 ounces of Magic Shave is what it's called, powdered Magic Shave. It's like Nair, but it's in powder forms for men, beard remover, hair remover, with 10 ink pens and a paper clip. And I still have, the last x-ray I think showed 5 ink pens and the paper clip.
How does one swallow? Is it a radio, or what is it that you swallowed?
I swallowed a cassette Walkman AM/FM radio and just crushed it up in chunks and slivers and just bend my head back and push it down my throat and then immediately drink water and swallow it down.
And why are you doing that?
I do that for many reasons. Sometimes the reasons are I'm depressed or I'm stressed, or, also just to, what I call pull a move to, you know, go to OSU or Oakwood just to get out of this environment, the ignorance and, you know, the what I call the animalisticality of all this, you know, just the hell of it. You know, I get tired of it, need a break. And OSU and Oakwood, the staff and COs and mental health, they're different, they're real. You know, I would say that they're human beings.
And Oakwood is more like a hospital setting?
Yes, Oakwood is a mental hospital for prisoners that are in prison. So.
And is that a relief to get out of prison?
Yes, just to get out of this environment, get away from it for a while.
And so you consciously do that, or is it part of your illness? Or explain to me what that is.
I consciously do this, and it's a part of my illness. I know and understand that I don't have to do this, that I can control this if I, you know, want. It's not that I am stupid or to the point that I can. It's just I don't care. When I get stuck in a thought, I go all the way with it, and I don't care of the consequences that I'll suffer or I'll cause other people to suffer.
If you think about this graphic for a second, focusing on the left side for a moment, themes of perceived burdensomeness or thwarted belongingness, did the individual articulate very many of those themes? Were those things on his mind? Was he talking about his desire for death, his ideas for suicide, etc., etc.? He was talking about non-suicidal self-injury, the things he does to ingest objects that basically change his mood. It also changes his environment. He was talking about that, and incidentally, he was only talking about a rather small portion of that kind of behavior that he does. He does a lot of other kinds of things too. The most typical form of that behavior is self-cutting. This individual engages in a lot of that as well, and there are other behaviors too. So he's talking about some of that, but not so much about perceived burdensomeness or thwarted belongingness or a desire to die. At that moment, he was not really in that state of mind. So the left side of the model doesn't really apply to him too well at that moment. What about the right side of the model, by contrast? In other words, do you think this individual is fearless of bodily harm, of physical injury, of physical pain, of death itself? And I think the answer to that question is yes, quite clearly so. Now, imagine a hypothetical scenario in your mind, and it's that individual, for whatever reasons that happen in his life, develops those states of mind on the left side there. He becomes like, he develops the idea that he's a burden, that his death would be worth more than his life, that he's alienated and cut off from everyone. You worry a lot about that scenario, because you got a person who's got desire and also capability coming together in the same individual, quite possibly culminating in either a very serious suicide attempt or death itself. This individual, of course, is incarcerated. He is incarcerated because of a very long history of assaulting other people, extremely long history of it, in escalating fashion. And that's yet another reason you worry about someone like this, is that if he can perpetrate that kind of violence on humans, well, he's a human, and should he desire to perpetrate it on himself, he probably will. By contrast, I'm going to show you a video. For this one, I'm going to turn off the sound because it works better that way. This is of our Golden Gate Bridge in the Bay Area of the U.S. It's from the documentary The Bridge. Anybody seen this documentary? A few of you. It's actually extremely compelling as a documentary. The idea of it, well, I'll back up a second. Filmmaker's name's Eric Steele. He and his crew of several people desire to make a true film about what happens at the Golden Gate Bridge to people who desire and enact their suicide from the bridge. He wanted people to understand the very painful truth of the aftermath, especially for the bereaved people, but also for people who work at the bridge commissioners, police personnel, etc. And so to do that, he approached the commission that runs the bridge, who control permitting for all the activities involving the bridge. And he approached them with deception. He deceived the commission. He said to them, my crew and I plan a film for the next year. We're going to film the bridge every day. And we're just interested in a modern art film about the aesthetics and the beauty of the bridge. And the commission approved that project. Unbeknownst to them, Eric and his crew were actually hundreds of yards away from the bridge with zoom photography, filming people walking back and forth on the bridge. And in doing that for a full year, every day they captured 24 deaths by suicide from people jumping to their deaths from the Golden Gate Bridge. If you're interested in this documentary, be warned that Eric and his crew made the decision to show some of those deaths in the documentary. That's why it's a very controversial documentary. One backstory that Eric does not promote in the film itself, but that is nevertheless true, his crew called the California Highway Patrol about anyone that they were worried about. They probably saved lives. They filmed deaths. They probably saved lives by calling the police about anyone that they were worried about. The trouble, as they quickly understood, is that they had no idea who was who up front. They would get worried about somebody, call the police, and police would check on them, they'd be completely fine. And then they would have their camera trained on someone else who seemed totally calm and together, who within seconds had perished. And they had no way of differentiating who's who. In fact, you can see this from this clip I'm going to show. Nobody's hurt in this footage, much less killed in this footage. I'm not going to show any footage like that, but this is real life, true things that happen at the bridge that are close. It's a close call, basically. But what we'll see at the beginning is just this is the data source that Eric and his team had. It's a visual data source, and that's all they had to make these differentiations. So what do you think? Is this person at risk? That's all the information you get. That's all Eric and his team had. It's hard to make the differentiation. As it turns out, this person is at risk, and we'll see that in a moment. A little bit more about that in a moment. Here's another example. Individual has a preoccupied air, perhaps, but at risk. Hard to say. Okay, you get the sense of that. This individual's not at risk, probably. He's engaging in an activity. And indeed, he's going to be the rescuer in the incident that we will see involving the first young woman who is at risk. So I'm going to fast forward this to, that's him there. Okay, so I'm going to pause this here. I just want to set this up a little bit. This young woman, we saw her walking to a high portion of the bridge earlier. Now she's scaled the railing of the Golden Gate Bridge and is just one step away from near certain death. The death rate at this bridge is 98%, so it's not certain death. There are people who survive it. And parenthetically, those people who have survived this jump, when later interviewed, most if not all say things like, when I got to the bridge, I was completely certain about my desire for death, so certain that I did not hesitate at all, and jumped willingly to my death. And then within 2 seconds, it takes 4 seconds between jumping and impact. 2 seconds later, I had changed my mind entirely. My body was just in the grips of an undescribable fear of death, and I had no recourse. Think about that. That's another tragedy of this phenomenon, where even people desperately suicidal like that, even they have fear kick in their bodies, and even they come to instant regret. Probably true of the other 98% who perished. They were having those same thoughts in those 4 seconds. Moreover, she has not done this on a mere whim. For those of you who have traveled to this area of the world, you can't just show up there. You've got to travel to that area. You've got to arrange transportation. You've got to get out to the middle of that bridge. It takes planning, deliberation, intent. She's intended what she's doing.